Thank you for that introduction. And yes, I am a Kiwi with an American accent. And so you will hear a little bit about why that is so. And a lot of it has to do with best laid plans and how often they really do tend to go astray. These are my parents. We are South Islanders. My mother grew up in Dunedin and my father in Queenstown. And they met and got married at Otago, which is why I was born in Dunedin. We came to the US when I was quite young for my father to do a postdoc. And I grew up with a New Zealand identity. We were New Zealanders, and we were going home next year. And next year was then the next year, was then the next year, as my biochemist father and my statistician mother could not find two jobs in the same city for people with PhDs. So we stayed in the United States. I'm married to an American, and I have a daughter who is the proud owner of dual citizenship. She's an American and a Kiwi. And this is us in our batch in the South Island. And for her, growing up, having these Kiwi connections is also a very strong sense of identity. She only gets to be here about once a year, but it is something that she finds very central to her. But I'm going to talk to you about my path to doing something like this. This is the Vinci Surgical Robot, and I'm Director of Medical Research for Intuitive Surgical. I work at the intersection of medicine and technology, trying to figure out how we can improve surgery, make it less invasive, and make sure that surgery is seen as just a little speed bump in people's lives, as opposed to a brick wall that they're crashing into. Now, how I got into that arena is I take things apart. And most of the time manage to put them back together again afterwards. My motorcycle ran just fine after this incident of maintenance. But no, really it was just maintenance there. I ended up at MIT as an inveterate taker-aparter of things and occasional putter-backer together of them. It was a wonderful place for me. And I went in planning to be a chemistry major. I had a biochemist father and a statistician mother. I planned to be a professor. That was the way things were going to be. And I ran into a series of mentors who had a very profound effect on my life. They noticed this tendency of mine to want to tinker with things and really encouraged that and encouraged me to think about becoming an engineer. And so it's Dave Wilson up in the top, who is a bicycling science, Woody Flowers, Ernesto Blanco, and the man who became my thesis advisor, Ken Salisbury, who all showed me that how exciting it was to love to design, but also to design for the human condition. And I was a part of a group of sort of an underground project at the university to build solar cars. And we were racing in Switzerland, and then there was this big race in Australia. And we raced in this inaugural race. And you can see, and finishing last after the kangaroo was the story that was written about us. In the meantime, though, the Sun Racer cruised to victory, and like days and days ahead of us, we were still up like by Ayers Rock when they were across the finish line. And this is me putting things back together again along the way. We stopped at machine shops, at little welding places, and had to fix bits of our car as they were falling apart. In that process, I met this man, Paul Mccrady. And he's most famous for the Gossamer Condor and the Gossamer Albatross, the human-powered planes that flew across the English Channel. He was also the head of the team that was the Sun Racer. And we got to know their team because our car was breaking down and catching on fire and various other sorts of things. And they allowed us to use their workshops. And so I got to know that team quite well. And unbeknownst to me, they decided that they needed to hire me. And so they called me up every few years after we'd been racing against each other in Australia. And eventually I decided that I was going to go and build cars. And I abandoned my original plan to be a professor And I left after a master's degree, which, telling my professorial parents, that was a little difficult. And I ended up building electric cars. And I collaborated with another Kiwi, Rod Millen, the rally racer, and we built hybrid electric off-road cars for the military. We also built a lot of cars for the domestic market, but the military was buying. And at the time that this had gone out, that's me in the driver's seat, one of my coworkers stuck this little fortune cookie thing onto that picture, which was, "Your place in the path of life is in the driver's seat." And that was a bit of a mixed prophecy for me, because I really enjoyed working on the cars. I really enjoyed building them, but I wasn't so sure I actually liked being in the driver's seat. Still, it was a lot of fun going out and testing them. And Popular Science did this article on us, and we went out and went crazy out in the deserts, driving it around. The next big project I worked on was the fuel cell system for the Helios solar aircraft. And the plane itself is a marvel of engineering. It's designed to fly up at the edge of the atmosphere. I was working on the fuel system, the storage system for this. And this was one of the times when I was handed a stack of journal articles, and they said, "This is what we can gather about fuel cells. You need to become an expert on this so that we can build fuel cells to send them to the edge of space." And this was where I was happiest, plowing my way through something that I had never tried to do before, and in fact, nobody had. And we built a laboratory, we built the fuel cells. I worked with Lawrence Livermore. We managed to get these things up into space. And around that time, the Department of Energy had noticed that I was doing a lot of work in fuel cells, and they came knocking on the door and asked me if I would run the fuel cell programs for the Department of Energy. This was a bit, it took me back, but it was a very exciting opportunity. And I didn't really know how to respond. The ultimate answer was no. And it made me embark on a lot of soul searching. I wasn't happy. I was building all of these wonderful, exciting things. And I was being offered this sort of pinnacle of success type of thing, of managing the multi-million-dollar programs for the Department of Energy on fuel cells and getting to go all over the world and run these things. And I was looking at managing people who were managing people who were doing what I'd originally gotten into engineering for. And success, by an external measure of success, was not success for me. I am not a CEO at heart. I am the person that is going in and doing the special projects and the problem solving. And as I kept getting pushed more and more towards being the top of something, I was getting less and less happy. So I demoted myself to first-year medical student, which is quite a demotion. And but I was back on the steep part of the learning curve. And why medical school is I had gone out and I had observed some surgeries where there were some new devices being used. And in one case, the device failed. And I got to listen while the surgeons and the engineers tried to talk to one another, but they were speaking mutually unintelligible languages. They didn't understand the other's world. And I was very interested in working in medical devices, but I realized that in order to bridge that gap, I was going to have to immerse myself fully, and I was going to have to understand the body as a machine. And that is what led me to medical school. Now, of course, I had more mentors at medical school. One is Tom Crummell over there, who firmly believed that there was a real role for the physician researcher bringing both tech and medicine together. And the other was Miriam Curette, who I ended up doing an enormous amount of research with while I was at medical school. And together we developed new procedures for this weird Da Vinci robot thing that was just coming into surgery at the time. I also, as an engineer wandering around in medical school with my notebook, invariably designed a few devices along the way, and I founded a company, and we got this device through the FDA as a hobby while in medical school. But eventually I did graduate, and this is my daughter, the one I mentioned before, who was then 3 by the time I graduated. I had her in the second year of medical school. And so as you can tell, it was a rather eventful time. But I decided at that point that I was not going to keep going on this path. I was not going to go to residency and become a practicing surgeon, even though that had been my plan at the beginning. But instead, I was working with this new robot, and I was starting to do some very interesting new procedure development. And I'd also seen how much leverage there was, knowing what I knew now, being able to do real product design in the area of medicine. And so this is the business end of the Da Vinci robot, and I will warn you, there's a little tiny bit of surgery towards the end. But what is so exciting about the Da Vinci is that every motion of the surgeon's hand is absolutely replicated by these little tiny metal hands inside the body. So every motion that you make, whether it be repairing a heart valve on the inside of the heart or working in the abdomen, you're doing it through very small incisions. So the person goes home with just a Band-Aid on their belly. And so all of this was extremely exciting to me. It allowed me to start to bring in a lot of the technical things that I was doing and the medical side, and be able to have a real profound effect on people's lives. And this is what my job essentially was. It's to look at technologies all over and try to figure out how technologies from lateral areas that are outside of our field are then going to change medicine and are going to change it so that when we design robots, we're there and meeting where medicine is going at the time when it takes us to get through our 5-year design cycle for a new robot. And it was a lot of, I was having a great time doing this. I didn't have to have any employees. I could wander around and always be on the steep part of the learning curve. One day I would be pulling out a textbook on laser physics because I needed to understand laser tissue interaction, and on another day I would be looking at drills. And so ideal job for me. And then something kind of odd happened. I was asked to give a TED Talk. And this was around the time before TED Talks were really like everywhere on the internet. Not that many people knew that much about TED. It was still sort of an obscure technology dinner party. But I gave this talk, and suddenly it changed my access. I was allowed to be in this larger dialogue, and the kind of serendipity, the interactions that then started to happen were really quite considerable. And one of them was Jenny Morrell from Number 8 Ventures and Morgo saw my talk and called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in coming and speaking at Morgo, not knowing that I was a New Zealander. I mean, because you can't tell when you listen to me. And when she found out I was a New Zealander, she was even more excited to have me come out. And really, this was the start of me interacting with New Zealand, not as the place where we would come and spend a week on the South Island in our batch, but instead as a technologist and as a member of the Kea community, and as being able to start thinking about what are the commonalities between the kinds of tech development that we do in Silicon Valley and what can happen in New Zealand. This also started a whole series of articles looking at dream jobs, all of these sorts of things, and allowed me to get more into the dialogue around women in science and encouraging young people to choose STEM careers. And at the same time, my husband and I started building a house, which may seem irrelevant, except that as a geek through and through, as we started building the house, I really started getting pissed off about the greenwashing and just how much misinformation there was out there about what was actually green technology and what was just given column inches in these green journals. And so I started meticulously documenting everything that was going into the house and looking at the embodied energy of construction of the house. And I blogged it on my blog, When Geeks Build Green, and it included rants about countertop materials, but it also included things like my spreadsheet calculations for how do you actually calculate the embodied energy of construction, which I published under Creative Commons and apparently is now used by architectural firms all over the world who have expanded it and are using it in order to be able to communicate with their clients about what actual green building means. So this led to another TED Talk, because, which I think I hold the record for the two furthest apart subjects of two TED Talks, green building and surgical robots. But by being part of this dialogue as well, it led me to a very interesting dinner party one day where I was talking to several people about vaccines. They had trouble tracking vaccines over the last mile in all of these places around the world. And when I tell you these are difficult problems, vaccines must be kept cold in order to be potent when they get wherever they are. And there's often not roads or electricity or anything along the way to where you're going to get these vaccines. And everything's done with paperwork. And everything is, so if you have 80 doses of vaccine and you get to a village and there's 120 kids, well, there's 40 that don't get vaccinated. If you have 80 doses and you get to the village and there's 40 kids, well, now you've wasted 40 doses. And so the logistics associated with this were really difficult. And so this dinner party was, hey, geeks from Silicon Valley, can you think of something? And I said, you guys need to go geocaching. And these guys from Geneva kind of looked at me with this quizzical look, and I said, it's a game. It's an international treasure hunt. In fact, I went out this morning and found several on the Wellington waterfront that can track coded objects from geographical location to geographical location all over the world, and you can do it from your handheld device. Maybe we could track vaccines this way. And that led us to talking to Wired, and in Wired World 2014, my new metastatic hobby was now geocaching and tracking vaccines. It is not that strange that these things that I was very passionate about and that I felt were very important, but had nothing to do with my day job, got traction outside. It's because it's the important problems, it's the problems that you personally are passionate about, that you're willing to put in the work and to make something real, to solve a problem that you perceive as real. Other people will recognize this and they will say, oh, thank you for solving that problem. So I give these examples not because, my day job is plenty interesting, but it's these other things that it's possible for everybody to do. Now, granted, it was the access of the TED Talks and being on those kinds of conferences that let me be at that dinner table that led to the geocaching, but those are the sorts of things that produce that kind of serendipity. So pop quiz. Does anyone recognize what this is? Close. First transistor, 1947, first transistor out of Bell Labs. So they were trying to make an amplifier. And they had no idea what this was going to turn into. How could someone have an idea of what it was going to turn into? But they had the vision and they were building it, but they had this beautiful, ugly technology. So to give you some context, 1947, my parents are still here in New Zealand. And this is what a radio, the best code cracking computer, and a mobile phone looked like in 1947. Fast forward to 1979, I'm around 10 years old. And the Walkman just came out that year. That's the Cray computer and the Apple. And I'm cheating a little bit on the cell phone. Cell phones actually came out a couple years later, but that's what the prototypes looked like in 1979. So I have a 10-year-old. This is a computer, a music player, and a not terribly good phone, but most of the time it works. It's not revolutionary as a computer or a phone or a music player, but what is revolutionary about it is it goes in my pocket. And it has changed the way I interact with information. It has changed the way I interact with other people. It has changed all sorts of things. Not in the technology area where it is, but lateral to that. And so in my job, I'm always looking for what these other things are going to be. And so the question is, what ugly technologies are in the labs right now that are going to change what you're doing? And the reason I ask this is because my career was not predictable from where I stood when I was in college. There was no such thing as a surgical robot. Nobody was doing anything like that. There weren't even electric cars. They were only prototypes in labs. And each time I went along my path, and I had this great plan. I was going to become a professor. I abandoned it, and I went and worked in electric cars. I had this great plan. I was going to save the world with electric cars. I kind of abandoned it, and I went into medicine. I was going to be a surgeon, and I stopped halfway, and I went into surgical robots. And each one of those could look like failing and running away, or it could look like getting new information and going somewhere new with it. If they hadn't turned out to be successful, we'd be calling them failing and running away. But they turned out pretty well, and to the victor goes the privilege of writing history. And so I get to call them great decisions at the time. None of them were easy. None of them at all were easy. In fact, a lot of them felt like failing, and a lot of them felt like abandoning my previous plan. And this is something that faces a lot of people when they are making a decision with new information. But the common theme that runs through all of it, and I think needs to run through as individuals, but also as an entrepreneurial community, recognizing that the best laid plans can be overturned by something new coming in, something better coming along, but it's not necessarily going to be obvious it's the right decision to abandon your current plan and move forward. But as long as you keep embracing learning and being willing to reinvent over and over again as new information comes in, and above all, be an opportunist. When something better comes along that is better than the plan you had, you can jump on it. Thank you.